Back in seminary, Dr. Richard Carl Hofler, who was our homiletician, that is, he was the teacher of the preachers, always advised us to prepare our sermons with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. His point was that sermons should be relevant to our daily lives. This week, the newspaper, the television, radio, internet, all that media has been especially shocking and horrid. For many of us, it is virtually impossible to imagine the pain and anguish and hopelessness of the families of those 20 children and 6 adults who were murdered on Friday morning. It seems even more devastating to experience such a terrible event in our Advent and Christmas season of joy and celebration. And as we think about it right now, we realize there are lots of other folk in our community, in our nation, in our world, who have little or no will to celebrate just now. People who find themselves in one of life's dark places. People in hospitals. People experiencing serious illnesses. In homes where there is no happiness. Folks reeling from job loss. Lives whose only future seems to be one of struggle. Hearts that are broken with grief. You see, that raises for us a rather specific question in our season of celebration. What does Christmas mean in the dark places of your life? You may have no crisis just now, but I expect there are very few people whose lives haven't traveled some dark places or some empty places. Now, there are some here today, perhaps very young, who haven't yet had such experiences. But over the long haul, there are very few people who will not find themselves at some point in their lives in the hallways of hurt or grief or guilt or struggle. And so, in this season, we must say, if Christmas does not mean anything in the dark places of life, it does not mean anything at all. And more importantly, if we can discover what Christmas means in the dark places, then we will know what Christmas is really about. So that's where today's sermon begins. Not in the brightness and beauty and happiness of the season, but in the dark places. What does Christmas mean there? The first thing we can put down is that when God came into the world as a person, he chose one of the dark corners of the world in which to be born. The world at that time had its bright lights, its sophisticated cities and societies. Rome was brilliant and powerful. It ruled the world. It was a center of trade and education. Alexandria, Corinth, Athens, Jerusalem. They were all places filled with successful, intelligent, talented, influential people. God could have chosen any one of those places. But the fact is, he did not. Instead, he chose a tiny, insignificant town in Judea, the town of Bethlehem, a town barely on the perimeter of the world, a town no one could imagine to be important or significant. But God chose Bethlehem. God could have chosen to reside with the rulers of the world, the might of Rome, the intellect of Greece. But God chose to become a Jew. The Jews were then, as they are now, the dispossessed people of the world. They lived on disappointments and regrets. Their tiny land had been oppressed by the powerful nations of the earth And at that time, they were living under the thumb of the Romans. Not only did God come as a Jew, he came to two very ordinary people. He came not to the kings, to the Caesars and Herods of the world, the political chiefs, nor did he come to the priests, the holy men of the time. He could have at least done that, but he did not. Instead, he came to Joseph, a carpenter from Nazareth, and Mary, a very plain young woman. Joseph and Mary were distinguished only by their obedience to God. Otherwise, they were little people, the kind who get pushed around by the important folk. In fact, an imperial decree pushed them from Nazareth to Bethlehem so they might be counted on the tax rolls of the Roman Empire. They set out on a 100-mile journey, not too impressive by our standards, but a very long and difficult trip if you had to walk or ride a donkey while being 9 months pregnant. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, they were late. The inn was crowded, every available space was taken. It wasn't anybody's fault. They were just late. The best they could do was a stable. So when God finally became God with us, he came in a stable in Bethlehem to two very ordinary people. In other words, as we stand back and look at it now, God was born in the darkness, not in the splendor of this world's brightest lights. You see, that's one thing that Christmas means. It means that God is in the darkness as well as the light. And that's a good place to begin. And as I think about it, and I don't know if your experience is the same as mine, but sometimes I think he is even more present in the darkness than in the light. It is as if those deep moments somehow shut out all the distractions. So Christmas means that God is present in the darkness. We may not recognize him any more than the people of his day did when he was born in that stable. But he is there. And when your eyes are opened, you know he's there. In other words, there is no situation so bleak that there is not the possibility for God's presence in it. When God chose to reveal himself in the fullness of his glory, he did it in one of the dark places of the world. And Christmas means more than that. For when God came into the darkness of the world, light came into that darkness. Now, there are three things to say about that light, and they are things you've heard before, but perhaps not in this context. The first is that the light which had come into the world is not what we usually mean by light. When we speak of light, we think about that which we need to see by, so that we don't go around bumping into each other or walking into walls. That is the light that we use to see things around us. But the light that came into the world in Jesus Christ is the light which enables us to see things beyond ourselves, things not visible to the human eye. One of the things that we each seek out as we grow and mature is the meaning of life. Not just our own personal, private lives, but the greater movement of history, of which we are each a part. The life we see constantly reflected in the creation itself, the general meaning of life. The sun, you see, does not throw any light on that, but Jesus does. As we seek meaning in the light of Jesus, we begin to see what it means. It means not to get, but to give. Not to be served, but to serve. Not to keep, but to care. It means what Jesus meant. Another thing we want to see is the way to go through life. especially the difficult parts. The sun sheds no light on that, but Jesus does. I am the way. And his way is the way of giving and suffering, of trusting God, of giving every last ounce of your life over to that trust. In Jesus' case, even when it meant dying. There isn't any other light but Christ that can penetrate that darkness. When you lie in a hospital bed, surrounded by light, the only light that penetrates the darkness is the nurse or the doctor or your family or your loved ones, those who are close. You see, Jesus is that sort of light. He is the light which is life. Now, the second thing about the light that came into the world is that it didn't banish the darkness. It isn't like turning on the light in a room. You flip a switch and the darkness is gone. It's not like that. It's more like a searchlight. It sends a beam of light through the darkness, and yet their walls of darkness are on the sides. Just think about that for a minute. You see, Jesus did not destroy the darkness of Roman rule, nor did he push it aside, but he cut a path of light right through the darkness of that rule. It was a path of a kingdom not of this world, the kingdom of God. Jesus didn't eliminate pain or disease or death, in spite of all the people he healed and the power he released to renew life. He would have been the last to claim that he had eliminated the things that make people suffer. He didn't eliminate them. He illuminated them by his own Spirit. Jesus didn't abolish sin, but he sent a shaft of light through the sin of the world. And that light is the forgiveness of God's grace. Jesus didn't banish the darkness of the night in which he was betrayed. He pierced that darkness with his own unswerving resolve. He walked straight through that darkness to the light of the resurrection. In other words, there is no darkness that cannot be penetrated by the light of God's love. It may be a friend, it may be a parent or a child, a pastor, or maybe even a stranger who brings light to your situation. But make no mistake about it, they are streaks of God's light. They do not banish the darkness, but they pierce it. And the last thing, and the most remarkable thing of all, I suppose, and yet it is the fact about the light about which I will say the least. The light is shining still. It flickers every once in a while. And sometimes we wonder if it may go out, but it never has. The darkness is made up of all of the evil we can think of or imagine in the world. And yet all of it together has never been able to put this light out. It's a light that shines independently of us. But I think that we need to face it. That by and large, if it is to shine in our world today, it is going to shine through us. Now, I certainly don't want to do or say anything that might take the joy out of your Christmas celebrations, because we really want to move to the deeper joy of Christmas, and it's this. We must be willing not only to watch the light, but to bear the light into the darkness and dark places of our time. Do what you can. It may only be a small thing, but small things are important. Sometimes the most important things to keep this light shining. I hope we can begin to see what Christmas means in the dark places of our world. And that leads us to see what it really means everywhere. God became a man in a dark place. And yet in that darkness, his presence was a light that made a way through it. And that light still shines. And it shines further when it shines in you. And as I think about it, I realize that St. John really put it in one line. And that line is this: in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. That is what Christmas means. Anywhere and everywhere, the light still shines, and the darkness has never and will never overcome it. Amen.